The Spinosaurus is a creature that needs a little introduction, being almost everyone's favorite spine-based reptile and Path of Titan's original apex creature. This semi-aquatic monster is still, to this day, one of the largest creatures in Path and boasts some of the most dynamic gameplay out of any of the current playables. Being able to traverse both land and sea, the Spinosaurus demands respect wherever it goes, and today we will be growing one on the official servers. Growth will be slow and the players unforgiving, but with time we will grow to terrorize the waterways and become the river monster we were always destined to be. But before I get ahead of myself anymore, we have to start our life journey at the beginning and earn our way to apex status. So join me, peeps, as we break free from our egg and spawn into the world of Gonda. Our journey begins as I wake up alone and afraid in the Ocean Pillars region next to the remains of some unfortunate creature that had died here in the past. At this stage, we were tiny and weak, and my glorious sail was only a small hump on our baby Spino's back. If we wanted to get any bigger, we would need to start completing quests, and luckily enough, we stumbled right into our first quest, which was collecting some rocks. For those watching who aren't familiar with how Path of Titans works, completing quests is a core component to growing your creature. Each quest not only provides 30 whole seconds of growth, but also rewards you with marks, the in-game currency which is needed to purchase new abilities and skins for your creature. In addition to questing, we also need to manage our Spino's food and water, and soon enough I found my first victim, a humble crab. And to my surprise, it actually started to fight back, but of course a crab isn't going to be a threat to us, even as a baby Spino, and we enjoyed our first ever meal of the playthrough. With a belly full of crab meat, we went on to complete our second quest, which was to head into the forest and collect some pine cones. Now, I'll be honest, peeps, being in the forest like this was pretty nerve-wracking. At any moment, another player could rush out of the trees, ambush us, and end our baby Spino's life and turn me into a quick snack. So I was pretty dang happy when our third quest had us returning to the beaches to find shellfish and abandoned turtle shells. The tall basalt pillars and easy access to the water kept us safe and hidden from any would-be predators, and a nice, warm, tropical rain began to fall. Unfortunately though, once I collected our last turtle shell, the region decided it didn't like me as much as I liked it, and didn't give us another quest to do. So in order to continue growing, we would need to seek out a new region to complete quests in. But before we did that, peeps, I decided to head out into the ocean and discover the nearby waystone. The stone was clearly meant for aquatic creatures to use, but since our Spino here is a semi-aquatic creature, there was nothing stopping us from journeying over to it ourselves. Once we got there, we completed the quest to find our first waystone, and we were greatly rewarded with 3 whole minutes of growth and a nice chunk of marks. But you see, peeps, we now had a new problem. Well, 2, actually. Our food and water stats. It turns out that crab from earlier wasn't very filling, and even though we are a semi-aquatic creature, drinking the very salty ocean water wasn't gonna be a good idea if we wanted to, actually live. So after a quick inspection of the map, I decided to head up north towards the Rainbow Hills region in hopes of solving our survival and questing problems all in one go. After a pretty uneventful swim, we made landfall, and thankfully, one of our quests was to hunt down 5 AI critters. This very conveniently highlighted the nearest burrow, and so we booked it over with my tiny little legs to see if anybody was home. With some gentle persuasion via scratching the roof of the burrow, eventually a tiny mammal emerged to see what all the ruckus was about, only to meet a swift end to my jaws. We had successfully hunted another creature, but as our Spino consumed the body, it came to my attention that our hunger bar really wasn't going up, and it became apparent that this little guy wasn't nearly enough to fill our rapidly growing stomach. I was becoming pretty worried that we might actually starve to death when I heard some sounds coming over a nearby hill. I cautiously crested the ridge and spotted yet another AI critter, which I thought would be another easy meal, but this dude wasn't gonna go down without a fight. After a surprisingly close encounter, the beast was down. We were close to death's door, but at the very least, we finally had a good source of food. Or so I thought, as we completely devoured the entire body in only 2 bites, hardly moving my hunger bar at all. So, yeah, it was quickly becoming clear to me that growing an apex creature was going to be a constant battle against not only the other players, but against starvation itself. Thankfully, though, water was a much simpler commodity to come by. This little pond was too small to hold any fish or frogs and would hardly be anything of note to an adult creature, but for a baby like us, it was perfect to fill up on water. Now, remember how I mentioned that growing would be a battle against hunger and other players? Well, sometimes that battle happens at the same time as our first player encounter was rapidly approaching. An Allosaurus was on the way, and it was probably just as hungry as myself. All I could do in hopes of survival was submerge myself in the shallow water of this pond and hope it wouldn't notice me. But this Allo was no fool and quickly sniffed out that there was indeed something in the water. We were at a standstill, peeps, because even at my size, the Allo knew I would still pose a formidable threat if it dared to come into the water with me, and conversely, it would absolutely annihilate me if I entered its domain on the land. So there we were, at a complete standstill, watching each other, waiting for somebody to make the first move. After a short while, the Allo decided to rest on the rock overlooking my pond, and I knew it was now or never, so I took a deep breath and booked it to the ocean. I must have caught the Allosaurus off guard, as it took a second to even realize what had happened, but sure enough, I looked back and he was sprinting after me. He was definitely faster than me, but it was too little too late as we reached the safety of the salt water and dunked ourselves in, successfully escaping our first player encounter with our lives. Which, you know, is nice and all, but we still had the issue of rapidly approaching death via the big hunger, so I couldn't stay in the water for long. And so once I was sure the Allo wasn't following me anymore, I came back up onto land, and conveniently I was able to complete another quest by collecting a handful of bloodstone crystals. We also ran into an old friend, the Screaming Tortoises. These dudes weren't really keen on fighting and attempted to flee from us, and that went about as well as you would expect. Individually, they didn't really offer much in the way of food, but fortunately for us, and very unfortunately for them, there just happened to be an entire tortoise family residing in these hills, so I mercilessly and methodically exterminated the entire bloodline. After the deed was done and we were soaked in the blood of the innocent, we had completed our quest to hunt critters and finally managed to fill up our food bar for the first time since hatching. I made a run for it, crossing the Rainbow Hills, and ended up in the Hunter's Thicket region. I was pretty nervous to approach this lake, as visions of being ambushed by hungry crocodiles, angry Sukos, or other territorial Spinos played in my mind, but to my bewilderment, I entered the water to find it totally unoccupied. That is, except for the wide variety of fish of all sizes that called it home. So, as long as I stayed in this region, I really wouldn't have to worry about food or water at all. And even better, there was a home cave located not too far up the mountain right next to the lake, which was perfect because we still had our initial quest to discover a home cave, so I decided to grab a fishy friend to accompany me as we started climbing towards it. Right as I was reaching the entrance to the home cave, a pair of juvenile megalania rushed past me and into the cave, shocking me probably just as much as my presence shocked them. So, yeah, with that humorous encounter, we entered our home cave for the first time. For those of you who don't know what home caves are in Path of Titans, they act as your creature's home base to upgrade and decorate with various quest rewards and trophies that you can find in the open world. You don't lose hunger, water, or stamina inside, so it's actually a pretty chill place to exist in and make your own, or log out safely without having to worry about being murdered. Home caves are also the only way for you to edit your creature's abilities that you can buy with marks. And after doing a little bit of decorating, I opened our ability menu and started to look at what we could unlock. We were only halfway through the juvenile growth stage, so we only had slots available for our arms and tail, with everything else being locked away behind further growth progression. For our tail slot, we had the choice between a tail attack that did little damage but dealt high knockback, or a passive ability called Paddle Tail, which would increase our swim speed and turn speed in the water by 10%. Both options were very appealing, but I figured I probably wasn't going to be fighting much at this size, so I opted for the mobility option and got Paddle Tail. Similarly, our front limb abilities have us choose between a claw attack or webbed claws, and just like with the tail slot, I prioritize the water mobility over combat, at least for now. We were soon approaching the end of our juvenile growth stage, so while I was in the safety of our home cave, I decided to make a game plan for where I wanted to go next, with that being the swamp in the middle of the map. But that was going to be quite a long journey, and we still had tons of questing to do in the Hunter's Thicket, so I exited our home cave, caught another glimpse of the baby lizard from earlier, and got to questing. We ran around collecting all kinds of mushrooms and pine cones and eating the fish and drinking the abundance of fresh water, and it was overall a super chill time. The only other players I saw were a pair of hats, which were just stopping by for stamina before continuing along on their own journey. Eventually, though, we did wrap up all of the available quests in the thicket, and so I grabbed yet another fishy friend and crossed through the forest and back to the ocean so we could start making our way to the swamp. While we were cruising along the edge of the coast, we came across something pretty peculiar, a concavenator hanging out with a sleeping hat. At first, I thought the conch was attacking the hats, and I jumped in to try and finish it off, but I quickly found out that they were actually friends. After a very short battle, we retreated back into the water, and the hats grabbed the conch and just flew off into the distance, never to be seen again. Definitely one of the weirdest encounters I've ever had in Path of Titans, but comedic nonetheless. I didn't let it faze me though, peeps, and we healed off the damage from the hats' beak and kept on moving towards our goal of reaching the swamp. Along the way, we would occasionally stop at some of the coastal regions to complete some easy quests, and When we were passing the edge of the burning forest, I saw my first hunting opportunity. A young Hycno. I dropped the sea turtle I was carrying to try and lure him to the water's edge, but he must have saw me as well and didn't go for it. As he passed, I knew it was now or never and gave chase after him. The Hycno undoubtedly outruns me, even as a baby, but I had a feeling that he was low on stamina and kept on the pressure. After crossing over this hill, he must have thought that I had given up or that he had somehow lost me, and I caught him trying to rest at the top of the hill. And to my surprise, he actually stood his ground. Unfortunately for this young player though, I was correct in assuming he was low on stamina, and he wasn't fighting me because he thought he could win, but because it was his only option. The young warrior fell with his honor intact, and I made sure to consume the entire body as to not waste any of the meat. This victory, however small, marked our first successful hunt on another player and gave my Spino his first taste of player blood. And so we returned to the mouth of the river, retrieved our turtle friend, and began to finally head inland towards the swamp. After a little bit more swimming, we had finally reached it, the Sharp-Tooth Marsh region, the perfect place to grow a semi-aquatic creature such as the Spinosaurus. The waterways of the marsh split the land into little islands and were more than deep enough for us to easily remain hidden under the water, and with plenty of fish, we also had an abundant source of food, and fittingly enough, the growth we were rewarded by discovering this region was enough to push us into the next growth stage. We were finally an adolescent. Though there was one problem with the Sharp-Tooth Marsh, and that was that the water was connected directly to the ocean, and because of that, all of the water here was salt water and thus undrinkable. Thankfully for us though, the largest island in the center of the marsh had a freshwater pond for us to drink our fill in. So with all of our food and water needs met, we could stay and quest in this region as long as we wanted to. For all intents and purposes, this was the ideal home for a Spinosaurus. Any threat could easily be escaped to into the numerous waterways, and we would be able to grow without really any worry here. That is, unless another Spinosaurus was thinking the same thing. Thankfully, the subadult didn't seem to be keen on cannibalism, and we actually spent a little bit of time together in the marsh as we completed quests and survived. But of course, all good things must come to an end, and eventually we ran out of regional quests to complete in the swamp. So I grabbed a trout friend to take with me, bid farewell to our older Spino brother, and headed out back to the ocean. Once I got back into the ocean, I went north in hopes of checking out the savanna grasslands, but without much water to run to in the grasslands in case we were ever attacked, I decided it'd be best to forego that adventure, at least for now, and turn back to the river and maybe try again further to the east of the region where I knew a few ponds were. It was during that swim that we happened to cross a Thalassodromius drinking at the river's edge, and after only a moment of hesitation, we attacked. While I undoubtedly gave that Thal a massive heart attack, my damage just wasn't high enough yet as a young adolescent to secure the kill before it could get airborne. I wasn't too upset about it though, peeps, as our hunger bar was still full from eating our trout friend that we got from the swamp, and little did I know, another hunting opportunity was fast approaching. But not before I got absolutely jump scared by this big bird just hovering over me. Thankfully, he couldn't do anything to me and I couldn't do anything to him, so we just went on our separate ways, and eventually he left me alone. But yes, peeps, just as we were approaching the end of the strait, I saw another Pycno trying to make its way across the river. Visions of my first hunt came back to me, and I rushed in to take advantage of its vulnerable position. Unfortunately for me though, this time the Pycno was fully grown and more than a match for an adolescent Spino, and he knew it. I was forced to retreat back into the water with only a fraction of my health remaining, and I decided to hide under a land bridge to recover my health and pick up the pieces of my shattered pride. I had forgotten that I was still very weak and very small, and I almost let that overconfidence kill our adolescent spoon. After reflecting on that encounter and healing back up, I wrapped around the savanna grasslands and ended up on the northern side of it, where I encountered a situation I was all too familiar with. A Megalania was fighting a Styracosaurus and losing, so it had fled to the water just as I had against the Pycno. Unfortunately for this Megalania, yeah, nature is hardly fair, and for this Meg, it was a case of wrong place, wrong time. But for us, it was a fresh and practically free meal that we got to enjoy. After I filled up on lizard meat, I could still hear the sounds of combat in the grasslands. Letting my curiosity get the better of me, I went onto land to see what all the commotion was about. I found a group of players consisting of the sty from earlier, a Kentro, a Campto, and what I was pretty sure was the Pycno I had just tried to ambush. I hid in a bush and watched as the two herbivores clashed and then just stopped. I was utterly and completely confused, and I assumed that they were all grouped up together and just messing around. I decided to call out to the group, making my presence known, and they were quickly joined by yet another creature. This time, it was a Packy. They seemed friendly enough as they all went to drink from the same pond, and I was tempted to join them, but I knew better than to approach a random grouping of players, so I stayed within running distance of the ocean and continued to observe. When a young hat started approaching, I got the feeling that I should probably start getting on my way just in case this Hats was gonna stir the pot and cause some trouble. I turned back to head on over to the ocean, and that's when the Hats finally noticed me and started to fly over. I stopped moving and was ready to defend myself, but... Huh? Yeah, I didn't bite him there. The Hats collided into me and somehow just died on the spot. I stood there in just utter amusement and disbelief, and even the Packy came over to witness the pure comedy of the situation. And of course, not wanting to waste a good free meal, I took a few nibbles out of the corpse and departed back into the ocean and began to head towards a home cave that was located out in the deep blue. Once we entered the cave, I took a little bit of time to admire just how big we had gotten in comparison to when I had first visited the home cave, using this bloodstone crystal as a reference. I went ahead and checked my abilities page to see that we had unlocked more ability slots now that we were an adolescent. I quickly equipped the claw attack in our second front limb slot, giving us the ability to claw things that were under us. Checking out our leg slots, we didn't really have much of a choice. The only thing that we could select was a stomp attack, so I unlocked that and equipped it, and our Spino was suddenly much more well-rounded. I decided not to waste the safety of the home cave and logged out for the time being. Once I logged back in, we returned to the beautiful evening sun streaming in through the roof of the cave, and more importantly, the well-rested buff. Granted to us by logging out within the safety of the home cave, this buff would increase our growth rate until we filled in the grayed out section of the growth bar, which was super useful. So with that, we left our home cave and I decided to head straight to the nearest region, that being the Mudflats. I wanted to take full advantage of this buff, and once we got there, peeps, I got my quest on, fully intending to take advantage of the well-rested buff, and I was even able to find another crab to consume, which took me back to our days as a fresh hatchling. Unfortunately though, peeps, things wouldn't be all sunshine and rose-colored crabs, as I suddenly found myself being hunted. A fully grown Pycno, yes, another Pycno, came out of the woods and was stalking me. I warily continued to do my quests, but I never stopped keeping an eye on the ever-present cousin of the Carnotaurus. Eventually, the inevitable happened, and the Pycno finally began to close in and go on the offense. For the first time in my Spino's life, I was the one being hunted. I hadn't forgotten the savage beating that the last Pycno gave us, but with our new abilities, I was feeling pretty confident. Unfortunately, my plans were quickly falling apart as I didn't know that the knockback from the Pycno's charge would interrupt and cancel out the Spino's stomp attack. I tried to get him with it a few more times to see if I could time it perfectly, but he was catching on to what I was doing, and with a final charge attack, I was slammed into critical health. The time for fun and games was now over, and we needed to get to deeper water. I was able to flee back to the safety of the open ocean, and the Pycno tried to follow me around for a little while, attempting to get in attacks when I would eventually come back on land, but each time I would just dip back into the water, and since my hunger and water stats were relatively full, I really had no need to stay on land. Eventually, he gave up on trying to wait me out, and decided his time was better spent elsewhere, letting me finish up questing in the Mudflats. Another combat encounter survived thanks to us being a semi-aquatic, but it was still clear to me that I was being very reckless, and that fight was kind of a wake-up call for me, peeps. Yes, I could retreat to the safety of the water, but all it takes is another semi-aquatic player to show up when I least expect it and finish me off. And so with that revelation in my mind, I decided to play a bit more reserved and focused on growth for a while. Food and water were relatively easy to come by, and we'd save combat for when we got a little bit bigger. After all, our majestic sail still wasn't even fully grown in yet, so we still had a lot of growing ahead of us. I eventually found myself back in the Hunter's Thicket, and I was really starting to enjoy this region. Again, the large lake was devoid of other players, and the quests were surprisingly easy to complete, with most of us having to collect things that were easily found around the perimeter of the water, and some were even in the water. Before I knew it, we had completed all of the quests in the thicket once again, and we were halfway through the adolescent stage. Before leaving though, I wanted to head back up to the home cave that was nearby. I was still thinking about that Pycno attack and wanted to make some changes to our Spino's build. So we entered the cave and I made the controversial decision to swap out Paddle Tail for the tail attack. This change would nerf our swim speed and maneuverability by 10%, but we would gain an attack that could keep things from tail riding us and cancel out things like the charge attack from the Pycno. I enjoyed Paddle Tail, but I felt that this was worth taking a hit to our overall mobility, and yet again, I logged out in the safety of the cave. When I returned, it was a very rare, bright, and sunny day out, which was extremely welcome because I feel like up to this point, this entire playthrough had been either at dusk or at night, so this was pretty refreshing. I had been logged out long enough for all of the regional quests in the Hunter's Thicket to also reset, so we had full access to completing all of the regional quests once again. And of course, because we logged out in the home cave, we had yet another well-rested buff for increased growth. Unfortunately though, things wouldn't be so easy this time around, and as we were questing, I soon heard heavy footsteps approaching my location. To my absolute horror, I saw a Tyrannosaurus Rex rapidly approaching, and he was coming right for where I was hiding. Swapping out Paddle Tail for the tail attack was definitely the right call, as we were able to use it to push him back and keep the Rex off of us as we quickly ran back to the water. Thankfully, we didn't see any more trouble at the thickets, and we were able to complete all of the area quests yet again. I was really beginning to love the Hunter's Thicket region, and I was considering making it the home of our Spino once we were fully grown. But first, of course, we actually had to get fully grown, so I left the thicket and had a relatively uneventful time, going from region to region, visiting familiar places and completing quests in the grasslands, the Sharptooth Marsh, and the Sand Caverns. And it's in the Sand Caverns where we came across an old foe, the Giga Turtle. This mammoth of a tortoise had tormented us in a previous playthrough, and so I was eager to finally take revenge. At last, the beast was finally slain, a rite of passage for our Spino and myself. All jokes aside, it felt pretty good to beat the Giga Turtle after our last playthrough as a Thalassodromeus. Check that out in the top right if you are interested, by the way. But on a more serious note, we had completed all of the area quests in the Sand Caverns, and the last one awarded us with enough growth to finally reach the sub-adult growth stage. We now had the ability to place a nest and produce offspring of our own and complete the circle of life. And the Spino's nest requirements only consisted of rocks and mud, which was pretty easy, all things considered. But the real question is, are we ready to become a parent? We had survived, sure, but if any danger were to come to our children, would I be able to protect them? I decided that we weren't ready for that responsibility just yet, and that we would need a lot more experience before our Spino could handle the burden of Cretaceous childcare. But now that I was a subadult, I was feeling a little bit more confident So, while I was swimming along the coast of the burning forest, I spotted a Megalania, and I decided that this would be a good trial by combat for our new subadult spoon. Even without our paddle tail, the Meg just couldn't outmaneuver us in the water, so it made the smart decision to run onto land, and I followed him. My Spino had absolutely no hope of ever catching a Meg. It could easily run circles around me all day and night if it wanted to, and normally I would have realized that this hunt was a fool's errand and that this Meg was only ever going to die to me if it wanted to. But my overconfidence was starting to get the better of me, and it didn't help that I also spotted a little pond further ahead on the minimap, and I did need the water, so I figured I would keep the chase going. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but this Megalania was staying around me for a reason. His bites were doing minimal damage at best, but the toxin it carried was wrecking my stamina pool. He was also slowly but surely luring me further and further away from the beach and the safety of the ocean. I figured I could always just run back to the water if this Megalania ever did manage to get me low, but it wasn't long until I realized that I was being outplayed and this little lizard wasn't traveling alone. While there was a lull in the fight and I started picking up some mushrooms, I suddenly heard footsteps. Very heavy footsteps. It turns out that this Megalania was grouped up with a fully grown Tyrannotitan and was only acting as a distraction until he could arrive, and I had only realized this far, far too late. I desperately tried to make it to the ocean, the Tyrannotitan hot on my heels, but my stamina was already drained from the venom of the Megalania, and now my only hope was to use our tail attacks to knock him back, or at the very least, get him to bite my tail and do reduced damage until we could ever so slowly make it back to the water. The beast was covered in my blood, and after I momentarily got stuck on a rock, he finally connected a bite to my body, which sealed the fate of our Spinosaurus. Fortunately for our story, death is not the end on the official servers. We respawned on the beaches of the Broken Tooth Canyon, clean of all the scars we had built up and utterly embarrassed. We had lost growth, and I couldn't even be mad about it because I got outplayed fair and square. The Megalania expertly lured us into a trap that I should have seen coming a mile away. So, feeling dejected and embarrassed, I swam all the way out into the ocean and into the nearest home cave. I took a moment to look around and reflect on what had just happened, and decided that the next time I would log in, that this would be the first and last time we would get suckered into a trap like that. When I returned, we yet again had the well-rested buff, and I realized now that we had the sense and hide ability slots unlocked after reaching the subadult stage. For the senses slot, we had 3 options. Only 2 were of any real use, though. The ability Drenched Blows would increase our damage by a whopping 20% against creatures that had the wet debuff. And then there was Lone Survivor, which gave us a 10% boost to our armor, as well as increased maneuverability on land as long as we were solo. It was a difficult choice. Both of these abilities came with some pretty serious benefits, but I ended up choosing Drenched Blows over Lone Survivor. For the hide slot, we also had 3 choices, but just like with the senses, I only really cared about 2 of them. The first being a Streamlined, which gave us yet another 10% mobility buff while in water. Our second option was Tough Scutes, which provided 10% armor. Again, it was a really tough decision, but I decided to double down and go with Streamlined. And with that, we finally have all of our ability slots filled, and our Spinosaurus's build was completed. And so I left our home cave and entered the dark waters of the Sweetgrass Shallows. I was still a bit rattled from dying to the Tyranotitan, and I felt a pretty immense guilt towards my own Spino for so recklessly losing his life, and that reflected in how we grew through the rest of the subadult stage. I played it safe, keeping to the oceans to complete quests without worrying about other players, and when I did come across them, I actively avoided combat entirely. I did scare the absolute bejesus out of this little Miragaya though. This poor dude must have had a heart attack seeing a giant Spinosaurus come around the corner. But yeah, other than that, our semi-adult life was pretty uneventful, and eventually I made my way to Red Island. This large landmass was located in the Southern Ocean and could only easily be accessed by flyers or other semi-aquatics. It was also home to a good-sized freshwater lake that was teeming with fish for us to survive off of, so it was a good spot to grow, and I soon found out that I wasn't alone. While I was eating a fish, a young Spino dipped his toes into the water next to me, and once he saw me, he stopped, undoubtedly scared for his life, just as I was, seeing the subadult Spino all the way back in the Sharptooth Marsh. I made sure to let the little guy know I was friendly and wouldn't try to eat him, so again, I got to grow with another one of my own kind, this time with the shoe being on the opposite foot. And it would be here on Red Island that we would reach the end of our last growth bar and graduate into being a fully grown adult Spinosaurus. To celebrate this accomplishment, I wanted to pick out a new look for our Spino and decided on the Iona skin. I felt like it had a great combination of looks and camouflage potential, so I spent my marks unlocking it, and we began the skin shedding process. Now that our Spino was fully grown, my confidence was beginning to return, and it was about time that I started to look for some territory to claim as my own, especially if I ever wanted to build that nest. With that new goal, I departed Red Island and headed back inland and straight for the Sharptooth Marsh. With plenty of food and water access, it was prime real estate for a Spinosaurus such as myself, but as we approached the central island, I could hear that I wasn't alone. I crouched down to silence my footsteps as we slowly made our way up the slope. It turns out the marsh was already home to a Suko and its adopted baby Sarco. Unfortunately for this family unit, a fresh adult Spinosaurus was rapidly approaching their location with a very violent eviction notice. Even with my inexperience in combat, our superior water mobility let us dominate the fight, and we quickly dispatched the Suko. I didn't plan on going after its child though. The Suko would give me all the food I could ever need, and a baby Sarco had no hope of ever challenging me. But it turns out that hearing and seeing your parent being devoured right next to you is pretty traumatic, and the young croc, well, took care of itself. The marsh was mine, for the time being at least, and it would remain that way as long as I could defend it. Just as I had thought earlier in my Spino's life, it really was the perfect place to settle down in and call home. Except there was one issue. To build our nest, the Spinosaurus needs to scavenge for mud and rocks. The marsh had plenty of mud for us to use, but there were absolutely no rocks nearby. If I wanted to nest here and make the Sharptooth Marsh my home, I would need to make a very long journey to find rocks and then haul them back one by one, giving plenty of time to potential threats or even rival Spinosaurus to come in and destroy the nest while I was away. So as much as I loved my swamp and was ready to get my Shrek on, I decided to abandon it to find more suitable nesting grounds. And so with that, I began our journey to find the ideal nesting location for a Spinosaurus. I had 3 simple criteria. I wanted plentiful access to water, food, and of course, nest materials. But remember peeps, building a nest was only the first step to completing the life cycle of this Spinosaurus. The fight with the Suko was a good start, but I was only just beginning. Along the way, we encountered a few less than fortunate individuals. I didn't even know what this little creature was, but that'll teach it to mindlessly drink from water sources without taking proper precautions. Plus, at the end of the day, I am an apex creature with a very large stomach, so I'll take any source of food I can get my webbed hands on, which includes this baby Sarco that I ambushed going down this stream. And okay, I can already hear some of you complaining that I'm killing baby creatures. But look, the way I view it is that growing up is an integral part of the experience in Path of Titans, especially on the official servers. It's meant to be difficult, and sparing a baby dino based purely on the fact that it's a baby goes against the fundamental design of the game, at least in my opinion. Plus, we did need the food. But anyway, peeps, I did go around and check multiple regions, but the area I kept finding myself liking more and more was the Hunter's Thicket. This region had served us extremely well growing up, and unlike the Sharptooth Marsh, I was actually seeing regular player activity here. And I gotta say, it was pretty fun ambushing other creatures like this and causing a ton of chaos. Poor raptor that we just mercilessly juggled also dropped a trophy upon its death, so once I finished eating its body, I took its feathers up to the home cave with the intention of putting it on display. Though, when I entered, I realized that our poor Spino was probably feeling pretty dang cramped in this small, dry cave, so I wanted to do something that I had never actually done before in Path of Titans, and that was add a new room to the cave. There were a lot of options to choose from, but none of them really called out to my Spino more than the pool room. Featuring a giant skylight and a shallow pool, this was the perfect spot for our Spinosaurus to lounge in, and more importantly, display our quest rewards and trophies in. So after spending a little bit of time laying around in the water, we got to work on decorating. I decided that this rock at the end of the room would be a perfect prehistoric display shelf and place things like bones and bloodstone around it to really make it shine. And with all of our other quest rewards, I just placed them around the edges of the pool to give the space some life and flair, and before I knew it, this cave was really starting to feel like home. But of course, we couldn't spend all day in here, so we ventured back out and into the thicket once more. I think it's safe to say that by this point, my Spino had definitely claimed this lake as its territory. We dined on Arapaima, drank its refreshing waters, and fiercely defended it from any creature that dared to come close to its waters. But let's be honest, there really wasn't much that could threaten us right now, especially not since most of our prey was consisting of younger creatures. But that was soon about to change, as this baby Aloe wasn't alone. It was one of the children of a nearby Allosaurus family who had tragically strayed a bit too far from the protection of its mother and father, and I had just caught sight of Papa Aloe. As I approached, he unsurprisingly saw me too, and soon we had a standoff. While slowly walking towards him, I spotted the female Aloe laying in the grass over the hill. For the time, she didn't really seem interested, and the male Aloe and myself continued inching closer and closer until I made the first move. He saw it coming though and dodged out of the way, but the attack had finally gotten the attention of the female Allosaurus. The male was critically wounded and had to back off, and his mate did a good job of forcing me to give him up. The fight had reset. I was barely damaged, but basically out of stamina. The male had fled to heal, leaving the rest up to the matriarch of the group. She was smart and playing very defensively. I had gotten a few good hits on her, so I'm sure she wasn't eager to press the fight. Unfortunately, her child wasn't getting the memo and was being a little too aggressive, and I was able to use it to force her into the fight. The battle went on for a good long while, with neither of us really being able to make any meaningful progress against the other. So it became very apparent that without her mate and with my slow speed and limited stamina, we were at a complete standstill. It was clear that she really wanted to try and lead me further and further away from the water, but after we got lured by that Megalania and killed by the Tyrannotitan, I was not falling for that trick again, and I would not budge past this area. It also really didn't help that her child would keep coming in and forcing her to come back to defend it either. After a little more time had passed, I knew the fight was over. Neither of us would be able to realistically secure a kill on each other, so I decided to disengage and recover stamina and the small amount of health that I had lost. But at the end of the day, I chalked this encounter up to being a win for our Spino. We had critically damaged the male and wounded both their second child and the female, but most of all, this fight was giving our Spinosaurus some good combat experience. Little did I know though, we were about to face our biggest challenge yet, both literally and metaphorically. Now that our stamina was back to full, I wanted to stick around just a little longer and stalk this aloe group. If any of them came down for a drink, I wanted to be able to ambush them and possibly secure another kill. However, when one of the aloes made a friendly call, I heard a response in the river to my right. It was another Spinosaurus, a fight of equal measure, and we already had it on the run. And just like that, we secured the biggest victory of our Spino's life. But unfortunately for this rival, even though I started the fight with health still lost from the aloes, the deck was stacked against him. You see, peeps, when creating your creature, you can choose from multiple subspecies that grant different buffs depending on what you choose. If you'll look at his sail, you'll see that it's completely rounded, which means that his Spinosaurus belonged to the subspecies that gives him an extra passive 5% natural armor, while ours, having a flat-topped sail, belongs to the subspecies giving us an extra 10% bonus swim speed. That, combined with our other abilities that further boosted our mobility and damage, meant that we entirely outclassed this rival in the water. However, we weren't out of the woods just yet. The Aloe family was watching, and now they knew for certain that I had to be on low health. They also knew that I had a Spinosaurus claw trophy, which would be invaluable to them to give to their child for an extreme amount of growth. I was safe in the water, but to turn in this trophy, I would need to scale the mountain and return it to my home cave. By this time, the male had also healed back up and was ready to join the female in the hunt. And as I reached the apex of this hill to get back to my home lake, they made their move. But unfortunately for them, the safety of the lake was just too close for them to realistically do any damage to me before I could reach the water. They really wanted this claw trophy though, so they stuck around hoping that I would come and fight them. But unfortunately for them, I had a belly full of meat and all the water I could ever hope for surrounding me, so I really did have all the time in the world to sit and wait them out. They stuck around for a little bit, but at the end of the day, they had 3 mouths to feed, and it was getting pretty obvious that I wasn't going to budge, so they left, meaning we could finally turn in this trophy. Our home cave was looking more and more impressive by the day, and our Spinosaurus was finally beginning to prove itself in combat. After healing back up to full health, I decided to head on back over to the Snake Gully River to see if those aloes were still around and ready for, what, round 3 at this point? And to my surprise, the corpse of the Spino was still here. It really does surprise me how long bodies last in the open world, and so I enjoyed a second helping of victory meat. Sadly, I couldn't find the aloes, but I did see a little Serrato in the fog, and I was wondering if he would come for a drink. Another Pycno also appeared, and I thought I was about to witness a battle between them, but of course they were on the same team. I stuck to my guns though, only moving with precise movement as to not create any noise in the water, and I was rewarded with the Serrato coming directly to the water's edge. Unfortunately, I wasn't playing super well, and the Pycno was able to knock me off target, and the Serrato was able to get away from me within an inch of its life. I thought that was that for this encounter, but boy oh boy was I wrong. Even though I was the apex creature, for a moment I felt like I was in a horror movie as another group of Pycno emerged from the fog and all started to attack me. This was by far the biggest group of Pycno that I had ever seen, and they were out for blood. Individually, none of them would be a match for my now fully grown Spino, but every time I turned to attack one, another would charge at me from behind. I made sure to stay very close to the water at all times. This could get pretty ugly if they managed to surround me, so by doing this, I could keep most of them in front of me at all times. Alright, one down, and like, what, 4 or 5 more to go? Thankfully, killing one of them seemed to scare off the rest of the group, and that's when I noticed something. This Pycno was holding a trophy in its mouth, and for some reason, he was deciding to stick around. I knew he was trying to bait me, peeps, and I wasn't going to fall for it. That is, until he dropped the trophy. Now, I'm not sure if it was intentional or not, but he wanted it back, and I wasn't going to let him. Sadly though, peeps, I had just got back from returning the Spino's trophy, and I was on a cooldown for picking up another. I wasn't sure how long that cooldown would last, but I was willing to wait to find out, especially since the majority of the Pycno group had left us alone. But unfortunately, I got a bit too greedy in one of my attacks, and the Pycno was able to circle around and retrieve the treasure once again. After that, I was pretty done with this fight, so I retreated back to my island to heal and rest once again. Once we were fully healed and ready to go, I decided that now was a good time to finally create our nest. The island that I was on had a huge mud puddle in it, and unlike the Sharptooth Marsh, there were at least a little bit of rocks nearby. I spent a little while trying to think about where would be the best spot to put our nest, and I eventually decided on this little spot in the bushes that I like to lay down. Here, it would be at least a little bit hidden by the bushes and look more natural than if I were to place it in the middle of the island. And just like that, peeps, we had a nest. Or at least the foundations of a nest. We would still need to bring over a ton of mud and rocks to actually fully build it, and thankfully we had mud right next to us, like I had already mentioned, so getting the mud was super easy, and luckily for us, there was also a huge rock pile just a small swim away, so we really wouldn't need to travel at all in order to get this nest built. It certainly wasn't a quick process though, peeps. Spinos make big nests, and big nests need lots of materials, so I slaved away, building it up slowly but surely, making sure to purge the area of any potential threats to my soon-to-be young whenever I saw them. And eventually, with blood, sweat, and tears, we finally got to a maxed out nest. We could now invite in another player to nest in as a baby Spino, but there's just one thing. I still wasn't convinced that our Spino here was ready to bring life into this world. We needed one final challenge to really cement our status as the true apex of this lake and a genuine river monster. And so I waited. I wasn't quite sure what for, but I felt like I would know for certain when it arrived. I thought it came when a Tyrannotitan visited my waters to take a drink. I set up an ambush and gave it the scare of its life. The fight was brutal and eventually came to a standstill. The Titan wasn't ready to risk its life, and eventually it ran away up the mountain. It tried to lure me in to follow it, but I had already learned the hard way not to fall for that bait. It was a good fight, don't get me wrong, but it just wasn't what I was looking for. Later that same night, I found a Suko trespassing in my waters, and when it locked eyes with my Spino, it knew it made a mistake. Quickly found out it was no match for me in the water and ran onto land where I wouldn't be able to catch it. I thought I was going to have an interesting battle on my hands, but just like the Titan, this Suko had no interest in fighting to the death and conceded the lake back to me. I walked around on land for a little bit, desperately trying to bait the Suko into possibly trying to ambush me and try for a round 2, but I just never saw him again, and so we walked back to the water. Little did I know, though, we were being stalked. I started to go back to my island, but I heard the sounds of combat happening on the cliff above me. Curious as to what I was going on, I left the water, crouching down as to be as quiet as possible just in case I could get the jump on the survivor, and I saw a Styracosaurus laying in the sun, and it clearly saw me and immediately ran into the forest. I was gonna follow it for a little bit, but then I heard it. The all too familiar sound of something large swimming. Without any hesitation, I dove off the cliff into the water and finally found the challenge that I had been searching for. We had done it! A rival Spino, this time also built for the water. We had taken on our mirror match, the most dangerous fight that we could possibly come across, and come out of it victorious. This was all the proof that I needed that we were truly ready to bring new life into this world and that I would be able to defend it. So I didn't stay long, and we made our way back to the nest to see if any players wanted to nest in as a baby Spinosaurus. After waiting some time near the nest, we finally had somebody accept the invitation, and an egg materialized in the nest as a baby spoon was trying its best to break free. This is what our entire lives had led to. Every quest, every fight, every scar, and every trophy led us to this exact moment. Our offspring was here, alive and well, and I had already brought a gift for it. We were finally a parent, and the circle of life was completed. So there you go, peeps. This was the life of a Spinosaurus. I know this isn't my normal kind of content, so I super appreciate you for watching this and reaching the end. If you like this type of stuff, please leave it a like, and if you're feeling up for it, give the channel a sub if you want to see more of this in the future. These kinds of videos take a good long while to produce, so it would really mean the world to both me and the YouTube algorithm if you did. And if for some reason you're feeling extra charitable, become a channel or patron member by either clicking the join button or finding a link in the description. You'll get access to an exclusive Discord server, as well as access to all of my videos early, as well as an ARC server if you happen to play that game. And all right, I'll stop shilling, but seriously, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye-bye!